you very much.
Sorry, I have this vision of my face in the large screen and my voice booming around earlier, so I hope it wasn't too awful. But let's take 3. So hello everyone, I'm really sorry that I'm not with you in Birmingham. I was really looking forward to being there, but never mind. It's lovely in Scotland today as well. And what I'm going to be talking to you about wasn't planned to be in this session, but does involve some humans. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So my area of work that I wanted to share with you concerns the seasonal rhythms of organisms that make up our forests. And this discipline of phenology, which is why life cycle events happen when they do and what triggers them, is a really broad discipline that brings in sort of all areas of ecology and is obviously relevant to all organisms, from emergence of insects, leaf renewal, through to flowering and fruiting from plants, and also the ecological processes that happen in forests. But what really draws all these different aspects together is how seasonal rhythms are generally triggered by climatic events, seasonal climatic events, and therefore are very sensitive to climatic change. And phenology itself is put out there as an essential biodiversity variable that really, when we're thinking about monitoring forests, we really need to be including phenology as one of the key monitoring elements. So I can't see the top of this on my screen, but hopefully you can. So at the top, it just says climate and atmospheric conditions. If online, you can't see that. And what I wanted to just show in this graphic is how plant phenology, I think you can understand how that is often triggered by seasonal climatic events, such as a change in temperature or day length. And within plants themselves, we're thinking about phenophases such as leaf renewal. We're thinking about flowering, fruit set, fruit growth, and fruit ripening, which are all sort of dependent on the step before them, but also may have their own interactions with climate. But then when we're looking at that in the context of the wider ecosystem, obviously each of those phenophases is producing resources which are important for animals and animal ecology. So when we're thinking about the phenology of animals themselves, where their movement, their reproduction, their survival, they're going to be directly influenced by the occurrence and the frequency of each of these phenophases. And we're learning more and more how animal ecology itself feeds back onto atmospheric and climatic conditions. And then, of course, we have human society. Humans can be dependent on wild plant resources directly in the same way that animals are harvesting resources, whether that's wild resources or through agriculture, but also the influence that plant phenology can have on animal ecology brings humans and animals together in lots of different ways. So whether that's animals moving across the landscape and how that has to be dealt with by human society. And then, of course, the really big arrow here, which should be in really bold, is human society going back to climate and atmospheric conditions, because we are, through our energy systems currently, the dominant influence on climatic change. So the story that I'm going to tell you today comes from Lope National Park in Gabon in West Central Africa. This is the Ogwe River flowing along the northern edge of the national park. And this is a very beautiful and unique landscape of these savannas, bordered by these gallery forests along the river. And as you move further into the southern edge of the national park, you get more towards continuous forest, as you might imagine in this part of the world. Not only is there a great diversity in the landscape and in the plant community, we have a full suite of very charismatic fauna, which make Gabon very famous for its great apes, its elephants, its mandrills, etc. And what's really fascinating about Lope is how the plants and animals really closely interact. So here is a selection of seeds that are disseminated by the great apes, and these are seeds that have been collected from their dung. And there's lots of really interesting stories that link the trees to the animals and how they depend on each other. So this is the Mwabu tree, Bionella toxisperma. It has a huge canopy. I think one has been measured as the size of a football pitch at Lope. And in this photo here, there is a deciduous event. So all the leaves have been shed at the same time, and the little dots on the ends of the branches are flowers. So as you can see, the forest around it is evergreen. So it's just this species that is shedding its leaves at this time. And so you can imagine this is a really big event once the fruits come through, which are these kind of large mango-like fruits with a very sweet, pulpy exterior, which bring lots of animals to this tree because it's obviously such a delicious fruit to eat. And this doesn't fruit every year, but the trees are synchronized. And you can imagine that lots of animals gather here to eat these fruits, but it's only really elephants who can swallow the seeds whole and disperse them as a seed disperser. Except that humans also are really drawn to this species because the nuts are very highly prized for the oil that they contain. And this is a very important indigenous fruit tree, and people gather these seeds and process them to release the oil, which has great cultural and medicinal importance. And of course, when humans gather seeds and take them back to the village, they're also dispersing seeds, either on purpose, they are planting wabi trees, or just shedding them along the roadside. And it's often thought by anthropologists that when you find a wabi tree in the forest, it's great evidence that there was once a village here. So humans are a really great part of this seed dispersal story as well. So it's within this context, this really rich context of trees and animals and humans, that the SEGC research station was established at Lope National Park by Caroline Touton in the 1980s, who's in the picture on the top left. And there are a number of other people who have contributed to this over the last 30 to 40 years. Most notably Lee White, Minister of Environment currently in Gabon, Kate Abernethy, who's a professor at the University of Stirling, and Edmond Dumoto and Jite Dinkangadisi, who have contributed for decades to the field research, and the current station manager, Loic Makaga. So everything that I will share now is obviously work that they have pioneered. So there are many data sets that have been gathered as these researchers have observed the forest. But the one that I'm going to talk about is the Phenology Data Set. So the researchers really wanted to understand seasonal resource availability for the great apes and later on for elephants. So they started marking individual trees and observing when they were coming into different leaf phases, when there were flowers, when there were fruits, and when those fruits were ripening. And over time, this data set has grown, and every month these canopies are observed, and now there's more than 2,000 focal canopies that have been in and out of this data set of more than 80 species. And we have these individual time series at the monthly time step for each of these phenophases per individual tree. And we obviously have complementary data for those trees as well in terms of their size, their height, etc. So just in general, this landscape has 2 dry seasons a year, one very long dry season from June to September, and a period in the middle where there is almost no rain at all. It's also very cool during that time, so it acts as a little bit of a biological winter. And the colour of the trees on the outside of this circle is supposed to represent how much fruit there is. And there is fruit available all year round because different species and even some individuals within the same population can be fruiting at different times. But there is least fruit available during this long dry season. And then there is an abundance of fruits as the rains return. But also there is much interannual variation and variation between species. And very early on, Caroline Touton noticed and published in 1993 this hypothesis of a link between a drop in nighttime temperatures during the long dry season and subsequent fruit production for about 6 of the tree species. And she discovered this because of an abnormal fruiting outside of the normal season after a drop in temperature, and then a reduction in fruiting after quite a warm long dry season. And she said back in 1993, if this hypothesis is true, the potential importance is great. A small permanent increase in minimum temperature resulting from global warming would have dramatic consequences. Not only would certain tree species in low pay cease to reproduce, but also the quantity of food available to frugivores would be drastically reduced. So my work coming into this research group about 6 years ago was to bring together the weather data, the plant phenology data, and then working with colleagues such as Robin Wissock, we've brought together some new animal data sets as well. And in 2020, we published this paper following on from, now we have 30 plus years of data, and we can look at these long-term trends. Unfortunately, as Caroline predicted, we are seeing a massive reduction in fruiting at Lope, which we think is probably related to increased temperatures, and highly likely that fruit-dependent animals like elephants are already feeling the impacts of that. So just briefly, we've shown that nighttime temperatures, this is data collected at the site, and this region is very, very data poor, so this data is very valuable. It's nighttime temperatures have increased by almost a degree over the last 35 years. And in terms of the plant phenology, this is just a summary plot here from a generalized linear model, bringing together all those thousands of focal canopies and 73 species. But we just show here in blue, this is all species in the data set, showing a reduction in the probability of encountering ripe fruit in any given month of the year for any tree species. And the red just highlights 14 fruit species that are especially important for elephants, the focus of this study. This is another way of looking at the same data. So we call this ripe fruit availability. And this is just to be able to show across the whole community how, okay, there are interannual differences. There are good fruiting years and poor fruiting years. But since 2000, the good years are much worse than the poor years prior to 2000. And then this really helps to see, you know, what change there has been in this ecosystem. We gathered together a huge database of photographs of elephants taken over the last 20 years. And Robin Whittock led on this part of the analysis. And these photos were scored for the body condition of these animals, and we showed a reduction in the body condition over this time period. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, it's much more common now to be seeing elephants that are very skinny, and we can see that through their hips and their spine sticking out through their skin. So when we're taking a step back and thinking about what we're observing in these forests, and particularly tropical forests, and when we're thinking about phenology, it's incredibly complex. There's not one certain time of the year to focus our efforts. There's different species doing things at every different time of the year, depending on how they are adapted to survive in that climate. When we're thinking about the result I've just showed you, we're really seeing how, you know, okay, this availability of ripe fruit is we think is already impacting animal ecology, specifically the forest elephants, but we know that this change is actually consistent through to it's a reduction in flowering. So it's not just a pollination issue, it goes further back in that phenological chain, as I've illustrated there. And we can already begin to imagine how this is going to impact on human society. Elephants are gardeners of this forest. Where we have elephants in forest, there is higher carbon storage because of the way that they disturb and garden the forest. We also have the potential for elephants to be moving out of the forest more towards villages and interacting more closely with people, and people and elephants have a very complex interaction. And this feeds then back onto governance and decisions that are made in terms of managing the forest. So this is an incredibly complex picture and an important story to investigate further. And just one other point, I wanted to think about that Moabi tree. Moabi trees can live for 1,000 years. They don't start reproducing till after 100 years. If they stop fruiting for 20 years, does it really matter? That one tree needs to reproduce itself successfully in 1,000 years. So this could just be like a blink of an eye for that tree. And when we are measuring trees, they have a real ability to persist in the landscape for a long time, way beyond that they are ecologically, functionally extinct. So the animals that disperse these fruits may be gone, but the tree is still standing there. So monitoring the phenology really brings us back to those timeframes in which not only are they really important for us right now, they're also really important policy-wise, because politicians can really start to understand things that will have an impact next year, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. You know, when we talk about climate change, we often talk about 50, 100 years' time, and we slip outside of that kind of policy frame of decision makers. So I think phenology has a real power as well to bring us back into tomorrow's resource availability. So phenology data and networks are lacking in the tropics. They are mostly centered around the Northern Hemisphere. But there is phenology data in the tropics, and the two longest sites for forest communities are BCI in Panama and Lope National Park. But to try and address this, we formed the African Phenology Network about 5 years ago, and our aims are to support research collaborations across the continent, to widen access and integrate methods, to grow new leadership in the field. This is our current steering group. All of us are early career researchers, and we have representatives from Ghana, Gabon and Kenya currently, but we have a network outreaching to many more countries within Africa. And essentially, we want to provide good data to support a thriving planet. We just recently had our first funded project, and our main outcomes of that were that we really need to scale up research ambition and collaborate across tropics, particularly because we face some of the same logistical challenges. We need to standardize and integrate field and data methods, and we need to invest in training and access to new technologies. And specifically, the data that I've shown you here, and I'm just wrapping up now, shows ground observations, which are really important, but they rely on experts who are there consistently for many, many years at a time. And this is a real challenge for field sites in terms of maintaining those salaries and the expertise on the ground. So one of the ways that we can move forward with that is by the use of phenocams, and it's really being pioneered in the tropics by Patricia Morelato's lab at UNESCO, and particularly Bruna Alberto, who's been helping us in terms of using trail cams to monitor plant phenology. And we've also had a go at using Sentinel-1 data to observe these very large canopies. It's not perfect. We have a lot of cloud cover in Lope, which really makes remote sensing very difficult, but we did have some progress with these very large canopies such as Mobi. So that's everything from me. And I look forward to the discussion. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks a lot for all the speakers. It was a great session. I'm very happy to hear about all these different perspectives, and including animals and humans and their relationship to forests. So now we have time for questions. Questions from the audience. Any questions? Carolina?
Thank you all for these talks. My question is for Susanna.
Here. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I was listening to your talk, which was super interesting. And one thing that caught my attention was the fact that you mentioned explicitly that there is not enough harvest overall. And I was thinking that, for example, you are using data from national forest inventories from countries where forests do not have a harvest function, really. They are protective. For example, in Spain, not because I am Spanish, but sorry. But it's true, there is a big